सहनाववतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सह वीर्यङ्करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। श्रुतिस्मृतिपुराणानाम् आलयं करुणालयं नमामि भगवत्पादं शङ्करं लोकशङ्करं शङ्करं शङ्कराचार्यं केशवं बादरायणं सूत्रभाष्यकृतौ वन्दे भगवन्तौ पुनः पुनः। ईश्वरो गुरुरात्मेति मूर्तिभेदविभागिने व्योमवद्व्याप्तदेहाय दक्षिणामूर्तये नमः। So, our inquiry into Drg Drashya Viveka, separating the drashta from the drishya, the seer from the seen, is going on. Last time we were discussing about who is the real samsari, or rather, where does samsara, to whom does the samsara belong? Samsara means sense of limitation. Who feels this sense of limitation? Who feels that I am limited, I am bound, I am unhappy? Who feels this? Because we saw that consciousness cannot feel it. Consciousness is asanga by nature. It is complete, so it cannot feel this. Neither can matter, that is the body, mind, intellect, prana, complex. They are inert by nature, so they also cannot feel limited. Sense of limitation does not fall there, nor does it fall to consciousness, neither does it fall to consciousness nor to the matter. And there are only these two things. What? Consciousness and matter, drashta and drishya. None of them can feel this sense of limitation. Then the question is a very important question. Who feels the sense of limitation? Who is samsari? This we were discussing. Samsari means, let me repeat again, samsari doesn't mean that you have a family, that you have parents, that you are working. That is not samsara. Samsara is sense of inadequacy, sadness, unhappiness. I am limited. I am bound by time, by objectivity, by space, means the sense of bondage which one feels is samsara. With all your family, you need not feel this. With all your career and responsibilities, you need not feel this. And even if you have none of this, then also you can feel this sense of limitation. So who feels that? That we were discussing. And verse number 6 was talking about this. So here the Granthakara, the author, very beautifully shows who feels this sense of limitation. So we were discussing that verse, and that is verse number 6. Let me repeat that. Chichaya veshato buddho bhanam dhistu dvidha sthita ekaham krutiranyasyat antah karana rupini. So very beautifully it shows that there is chichaya aveshatah buddho bhanam. Now let us recap quickly that in spite of the body, the mind, the intellect, the pranas, the sense organs, that means the whole body, is inert, as we have already said many times, that is inert, and still it appears as conscious. The mind appears as conscious. It thinks, it decides, it doubts. Body also works, body also functions. Now, if it is inert, it should not be able to do all this, but still it does. That means there is some source of consciousness. So, in spite of being inert, it is still functioning, and functioning very well. How does this happen? So, the author says, Chit Chaya Aveshatah Buddho Bhanam. It is due to the Avesha of Chit Chaya. That is, the consciousness, the light of the consciousness gets reflected into the intellect. Buddho Bhanam. Because of this luminosity of consciousness getting reflected in the buddhi, the buddhi now becomes conscious. It is not conscious on its own, but because of the luminosity of consciousness getting reflected, Chit Chaya, because of the reflection of the consciousness getting reflected in the mind, that is buddhi, the buddhi also is filled with light, filled with consciousness. And further, now this intellect is divided into two. Not divided, but it is twofold. Dhis tu dvidha sthita. Dhi means intellect or the mind. Now that I will explain later, that this intellect and mind, all of them are sometimes, these words are used for the same thing. They are used specifically only when we refer to the functions which they perform. But at the moment, let us say that intellect is twofold. Intellect is these two dvidha sthita. It is twofold, which is that one part, eka ahankritihi, one is I thought. Ahankriti means ahankara. One is I thought. In the buddhi, one is I thought, ahankritihi, and the other one is antakarana rupini, which means it has you thought. I thought, you thought. Both are found in the same intellect. Okay. Now, to be more precise, see, antakarana is divided into four. This is what we read, this is what we find in other texts, and precisely in Tattva Bodha. There, Sri Shankaracharyaji, the Bhashyakara, says that antakarana is divided into four. Or let us say that it gets four names depending upon the kind of function they perform. Which are these four? Then it is manaha, buddhi, chitta, ahankara. Follow? These four. Manaha, buddhihi, chitta and ahankara. Now, these three, manaha, buddhihi, chitta, this three is one class and ahankara is another class. So, these three here, manaha, buddhi and chitta, are put in the class of you thought, and ahankara is put in the class of I thought. So, the same antakarana is having two parts. One is I thought and other one is you thought. This I thought is called ahankara, subject, and the you thought is it has idam vritti. And which are those? Manaha, buddhi and chitta. So, this is how Bhashyakara explains. In short, antakarana itself gets divided into these two. One is I thought, other one is you thought. One is subject, another one is object. Okay. Now, let us take last time we took the example of the sun getting reflected into a bucket of water. To show, to illustrate how body, which is body, mind, intellect complex, in spite of being inert, appears as conscious. How does this happen? So, here they explain with the example of sun, which is full of light, very bright, getting reflected into bucket of water, bucket filled with water. Okay, if the bucket was empty, the sun will not get reflected. But since bucket is filled with water, and that water is very pure and transparent, means it is without any dirt, let us say the water is filled in the bucket. Now, the sun gets reflected into the bucket of water. So, because it gets reflected in the bucket of water, reflection of the sun is seen here in the water. Because of that, the water is now lighted. It is filled with light. You follow? Even though that light doesn't belong to the water, that light belongs really to the sun. But since the water has the capacity to reflect the light, but if the bucket did not hold water, then that bucket would not have reflected sun. But since the bucket has water in it, it is able to reflect sun. So understand, not every medium reflects light. No. It is only certain mediums which can reflect light of the sun. So, getting back to the example, sun is getting reflected in the bucket of water. Now, as I said, it was by itself without light, but now since the reflection has entered the bucket, it has got lighted. So, this is, now we get back to the darshtant, which means what we are trying to explain by the example. So, here what we are trying to explain is that there is consciousness and the body is there. Body, sthula sharira, cannot reflect. See, again, as I said, if the bucket cannot reflect sun, but the water contained in the bucket reflects sun. Similarly here, gross body cannot reflect consciousness. It doesn't have that kind of capacity. But body has also sukshma sharira. Sthula sharira is body. Body is sthula sharira, which means it is gross. But it has sukshma sharira in it. Sukshma sharira means antakarana. And antakarana means everything: mind, intellect, prana, sense organ, every one of them are included in antakarana. But out of them all, the greatest capacity to reflect consciousness is possessed by antakarana, not by sense organs, not by prana. Antakarana, and in that also intellect. Intellect is that kind of thing which can reflect consciousness. You follow? So, the light of the consciousness gets reflected into intellect. Let us say antakarana, and then into intellect, and then intellect gets enlivened. Chit chaya veshatah buddho bhanam. Because of the avesha, because of the infusion of the of the light of the consciousness, that it is the buddhi which gets luminous. It becomes sentient as it were. So, first intellect got bright. Intellect became sentient, as it were. And again that intellect is divided into two, which is that ahankruti, that is I thought, and the other one is what? You thought. So now what has happened? Samsara, or the sense of limitation, did not belong to consciousness. Neither did it belong to the body-mind-intellect complex, but it belongs to the third entity, which is born, as it were, of the union of these two. Which two? Consciousness and body-mind-intellect complex. You follow? Just as light of the sun is one thing, sun is one thing, bucket filled with water is another thing. Now, when the sun gets reflected in the bucket of water, what happens? Reflection is there. Now what happens? Samsara is neither to this one nor to this one, but it has, samsara is for sun looking at this reflection and thinking that I am small. I am so small. Now see, sun is not small. Sun is millions and millions and millions of miles bigger. It fills up the sky, and yet this sun, looking at the reflection in the bucket of water, thinks that I am only that much. And it feels I am so small. Why? Because reflection is always determined by what? The medium in which it gets reflected. Supposing the bucket was bigger, then the reflection would have been little bigger. If it was yet more big, then yet if reflection, but it cannot be as much as the sun is. It will definitely look small because the medium is small. And if the water is not that transparent, the reflection may be dull also. But who thinks that I am dull? Sun, looking at this reflection, forgets who he is. He forgets that I am in the space and I am vast enough, bright enough, nobody like me, and yet this sun, looking at the reflection, forgets and thinks that I am this much. I am small, I am limited, I am bound by the bucket and the water in it. Who thinks like that? Neither bucket nor the water in it, and neither the sun, but sun thinking that it is this. You follow? Thinking that it is this. This one is samsari. It is union of these two, as it were. It forgets. Forgets what? Forgets its true nature and identifies with this reflection. Thinks that I am only this much. You follow? And now, in spite of being bright and big, it feels small. What is the use of that bigness and brightness? Because it is relegated behind and it takes himself to be small. This is ahankara. You follow? This is ahankara. Similarly, getting back to the Darshtanta, consciousness is one, body, mind, intellect complex is another. This one is inert, this one is conscious. What is ahankara? It is union of these two. Consciousness gets reflected in the mind, in the intellect. Moment it gets reflected in the intellect, what happens? Intellect, which is divided into two, I thought, you thought, all of them gets enlivened. Now, consciousness, because of avidya, because there is this thing called ignorance, because of ignorance, consciousness thinks I am this one. Which one? Reflected in the mind, reflected in the intellect. I am only this much. Forgets it is consciousness, forgets it has nothing to do with this, and yet it feels limited. So, ahankara, our subject, what we were talking about is, where does this samsara belong to? See, these are all very important things. This is a method. This reflection, etc., is a method. It is a prakriya to explain why we feel limited. Why is this sense of limitation? Consciousness or Atma or Brahman cannot have this sense of limitation, nor does body or mind or intellect. All of them are inert. Neither can they feel limited. But when consciousness gets reflected in the mind, in the I thought, then it thinks I am only that much. And that is ahankara. That one feels limited. Why feels limited? Because mind is limited. The reflecting media is limited. Just as bucket of water is limited. There are many other buckets of water which are bigger than that. And looking at other reflections, this one will feel limited. Similarly here, consciousness as it were forgets because of this thing called avidya. This thing called, there is a phenomenon called ignorance, which is why it is there we cannot explain. But acharyas try to explain who feels this sense of limitation. There are only two things, consciousness and matter, Purusha and Prakriti. Prakriti is inert, Purusha is conscious. Purusha and Prakriti means what? Purusha doesn't mean man. Purusha means consciousness and Prakriti means matter. Purusha means drashta, druk, and drashya means Prakriti. Both are different. And none of them can have sense of limitation. One is inert, that is why it cannot have. One is conscious, that is why it cannot have. Then where does this sense of limitation belong to? It belongs to this reflected consciousness. Consciousness reflected in the mind, and that is Jivatma. Consciousness, when reflected in the mind, forgets that I am consciousness. What does it think? I am only as much as this mind shows. And always, what happens? Reflection will be according to the reflecting media. Supposing I am standing here and I have kept a mirror before me, then I get reflected in the mirror. Now, the nature of the reflection will depend upon the mirror. Why? Because if the mirror has lot of dust on it, if the mirror has certain cracks, not one or two but many cracks in it, then what will happen? The reflection will also be distorted. Understand this very well. The reflection will also appear distorted, not because I am distorted, not because I have cracks in me, but because the mirror which is reflecting me has cracks, plus it has dust on it. So my reflection will be very little dark, little dull, plus distorted. There will be cracks on the nose, eyes, lips, everywhere. And supposing I forget, I look at that reflection and begin to cry. And I'm frustrated. Why? Because I look so ugly. My nose is split. My eyes are like this. Oh my God, what has happened to my eyes? Why do I look so black? Why? Because I take myself to be that. You follow? I take myself to be reflection. I don't look at myself. My judgment of how I am is not based upon looking at me, but looking at me through the reflection. And the reflecting media, which is the mirror here, is what it is. So I will be reflected like that. And I don't look at myself, but judge myself from the reflection. You follow? Similarly, we feel limited. This consciousness, in spite of being consciousness, Chitihi, it is consciousness. It is full of happiness. It is all complete. It is one without a second. And yet, it takes itself to be limited. And then it becomes as much as the body is, as much as the mind is, limited to the mind. So this is, this example of reflection is given. It is called a model, Pratibimba Vada. Reflecting, it is this example, Pratibimba Vada means example of reflection, is given by Acharyas. Vedantic Acharyas give this example. What for? They give this example to make us understand that this is the reason of our feeling limited, helpless creatures. Why? Because we take that reflection to be I. So this is just an example. I will give you another example too, so that this becomes very clear. See, we have kept a mirror. A mirror is there, and the reflection of the sun falls in the mirror in one angle, and then it goes out through another angle. So if the mirror is kept here, first the mirror gets reflected, and then if you keep it in a certain angle, the other part in the room will also get reflected. So sometimes children play this kind of games, you know. They take the light from the, they keep a mirror, and the mirror, in the mirror the sun will get reflected and it goes out through another angle. So what happens? That because of the light of the sun, mirror first got enlivened, and then it lights up another things in the room. Other objects in the room are also lighted up because of this light received in the mirror, reflection received in the mirror. Similarly, the reflection of the consciousness first gets in the mind. In the mind, that is Antakarana, gets reflected, and then it passes on to the other aspects of the body. To give you one more example, to make this clear, you may feel that we are not proceeding. We will proceed, but these things have to become very clear. And sometimes if one example doesn't work, then some other example may work. Work in the sense, sometimes things are not clear with just one example. So we try to give many examples. Our intention is that the message should go home. And what is the message here? What are we trying to explain by all this? That even though body is inert, one thing, we are trying to explain two things. What? First of all, that body is inert, and why it appears to be conscious. This is one thing. And another thing is, why does consciousness or Atma or Brahman feels limited? And why, who has this sense of limitation? This one cannot have, that one cannot have. Then who has? The union of these two. And there is no real union. That also I will show you. So, really consciousness has not entered the mirror, really speaking. But if the mirror is there, it will get reflected. And there is no problem with the reflection. Let it get reflected. But if the sun doesn't have the complex that I am this much, then there is no problem. It can enjoy the reflection. Problem begins when sun, which is bright and big, thinks that I am only of this size. When it says I am only this of this size, this is Jivatma. This is samsari. You follow? This is what we are trying to explain through different examples. Let me give you another example, which of the electricity and fan. Now see, electricity is there, but in spite of electricity being there, if apparatus or appliances like fan or bulb, if they are not there, there will be no light. Electricity is there, but we require these appliances, you know. So electricity is there, and then the fan is there. The fan has the wings plus the motor inside. Just look at your fan. Fan has wings, 3 wings, and it has motor inside. So what happens? Electricity directly cannot give air, etc. But when it gets infused into the motor, then what happens? Moment it gets infused in the motor, then it passes on to the wings, and then the fan begins to rotate. Now, does the wings have the capacity to rotate on its own? No. Does the motor have that capacity? No. Does the electricity have that capacity? No. But electricity or the motor coming in contact with electricity, then moment it comes in contact with electricity, it as it were gets enlivened, and that passes on to the wings and it begins to rotate. On their own, they could not do anything, but when they came together, you follow? But now, if the electricity thinks that I am only fan, then it may have complex, because it is passing through the motor and the fan is rotating. That is fine. But if the electricity thinks I am only motor, I am only fan, then it may feel, oh, I am only fan, because in the same room there is an AC, there is light, bulb is there, there is refrigerator, there is television, all these things are there. Looking at the television, this electricity who thinks that I am only fan feels I am not refrigerator, I am not television, I am not as good as them. Why did that happen? Electricity alone did not have that problem. Motor on its own had no capacity to rotate. But when they came together, then a third entity was born, as it were. What? That I am only this much. Similarly, this ahankara is a union of these two. Which two? Consciousness and body along with mind, intellect, etc. As it were, it is a union. You follow? In reality, no union is possible. Consciousness, see, I would like to make it very clear to you at this point that consciousness cannot really become ahankara. It has no connection with anything. It is asangaha, totally unattached, and body, etc., totally inert. One is absolute reality, paramarthik reality, and other one is vyavharik reality, empirical reality. These two don't meet. But when this matter is close to consciousness, then what happens? Consciousness gets reflected here. This mind, specifically antakarana or intellect, has that capacity to receive the reflection. Gross body doesn't have that capacity. Understand? Pranas, only one which has got capacity is antakarana, and particularly in antakarana, intellect has the capacity, is the most sophisticated part in the sukshma sharira, is intellect, and that receives the reflection. Moment it gets reflected in the intellect, then there are these two, ahankruti and I thought, you thought. I thought means what? I am this much. So who is samsari? Understand this very well. Ahankara, who is this ahankara? Ahankara is consciousness getting reflected in the mind. Not consciousness alone, not mind alone, but consciousness reflected in mind, and then consciousness thinks I am only this much. This is where the problem belongs. This is where the problem belongs to. So, this is what I wanted to make very clear. And now we proceed further to verse number 7. Now, what does verse number 7 do? Let us make it clear first that, okay, you said that mind or the intellect receives the reflection of consciousness. But then how does the body become conscious? Mind became conscious, okay, because of the reflection of the consciousness entering there. Chit chaya, not chit but chit chaya, reflection of consciousness. Because of that, buddho bhanam, intellect got reflected. Okay, but how did this body receive consciousness? Because the body is also functional. Body is also walking, talking, everything. So it also behaves as if it is conscious, as if it has consciousness on its own. So how to explain that? So now this is explained by verse number 7. So let us read verse number 7. Chhayahankaryorekyam taptayah pindavanmatam tadahankaratadātmyāt dehaschetanatāmagāt. See, it says, how did the entire personality, the entire complex, not only intellect but the rest of the complex also appears conscious, appears sentient. So how does that become? So here that is explained by this verse. Chhaya ahankara yoho aikyam taptayah pindavan matam. It says that chhaya ahankara yoho aikyam, the oneness of coming together of reflection and I thought is like taptayah pindavan matam. It is like the fire and iron. When the fire and the iron comes together, then there is a red hot iron ball. So, this is another example to show how the body etc. becomes appears as sentient. So, I will come back to that. Let us first of all translate the verse and then I will explain to you. Tad ahankara tadatmyat deha chetanatam agat. Tad ahankara tadatmyat. Because of, first of all, tad ahankara tadatmyat, because of the oneness or sense of identification with ahankara, that the body also becomes sentient as it were. First the I thought becomes conscious, and because of identification with the I thought, the rest of the part of the body also become sentient as it were. So, this is how the translation is. Now, let us see. Going back to the earlier verse, it had said what? That the reflected consciousness comes into the intellect, which is again divided into two. What? I thought and the you thought, subject and object. Okay. So, now there is oneness between chaya ahankarayoho aikyam. There is this union of the reflected consciousness, that is consciousness reflected in the mind and then mind divided into two, that is I thought. So, there is union between, first union between consciousness reflected in this I thought. This I thought first receives the reflection, means it gets reflected. Consciousness is there, it gets reflected first in the intellect, which then gets divided into two, I thought. So, I thought is called ahankruti, or it is called ahankara. So, it gets reflected, it gets sentient first. It was inert, but it became sentient thanks to the reflection of the consciousness into the intellect, which became first I thought and you thought. But who gets sentient first? I thought. So, this I thought got sentient first, and then this sentiency over here passes on to the rest of the body, passes on to what comprises of the rest? Then it comprises of sense organs, vital air, gross body. All of them then gets consciousness in sequence. So, first I thought, and then it passes on to the rest of the body. You follow? And that is how the body also appears sentient. But how is this? So, here then example is given of iron and fire. Now, I'll explain to you. First of all, understand this very well. Chaya ahankara yoho aikyam. The oneness, the union, first there is union of chaya, chit chaya, reflection of consciousness into I thought. These two have come together. Consciousness is reflected in the I thought. Now, they have compared this to the fire and iron coming together. Now, let me explain to you what is this. What is this thing called iron and fire coming together, which they have given as example. What have they given as example? For what? Union of consciousness reflected in the I thought is like Taptaya Pindavan Matam is like that of iron and fire in a red hot iron ball. Taptaya Pindavan Matam. So, let me explain to you this example. See, there is this fire. Fire is there, it is one thing. And iron is there, it is another thing. Fire is hot, it has red color. When it is burning very bright, it has no shape as such. The flames are coming out, but there is no shape as such of fire. Yes, it is one property. What property is that? It is very hot. And red color we see because of that. This is one. Then there is this iron. What is this? There is iron, ball of iron, metal, and that has black color and it is round and it is cold. When you touch the iron, you feel that it is cold. So iron is cold, it has round shape, the lump of iron is there, it has round shape, it is cold and it is black, okay. But this is how they are individually. Fire is fire, red, shapeless, and iron is cold, round, lump of iron is cold, round and black color, okay. Now, when they come together, which means when this lump of iron is heated in fire, is heated up in fire, then what happens? Then they have mingled, because lump of iron is heated up. Now what happens when the iron ball gets heated up? Then what do we see? Then we see that it is a red hot iron ball. What designation do we give when we see when the iron ball is heated up? Then after some time the picture is of red hot iron ball. Red hot iron, we say this. Now how come, what is this red hot iron ball? When we see this red hot iron ball, how many things are there? Two things have come together, giving rise to a third thing. There was fire and there was iron. But when they came together, what happened? A third entity is born, as it were. And what is the name of that third entity? Red hot iron ball. Now, this red hot iron ball has property of both. When we say red hot iron ball, then redness, now this is Viveka. We have to do this Viveka in our mind. That redness in that red hot iron ball belongs to fire. Heat belongs to fire. Roundness, where does roundness belong to? Roundness belongs to iron. That shape, round, fire has no shape, iron has shape. So that shape, round, red hot iron ball, ball means round it is, it belongs to iron. But otherwise fire was fire, red color, and here there was roundness and cold. One lump of iron was like that. But when they came together, now there is a third entity. What is that? Red hot iron ball, which means it has the properties of both. Redness of the redness and heat of belongs to fire, that is of fire, and roundness is of iron. So red hot iron ball has properties of both. You follow? Similarly, consciousness is consciousness. Intellect is intellect, inert. But when they come together, meaning when consciousness gets reflected in I thought, then what happens? Or in intellect, then what happens? This was inert and this was conscious. But when this came together, when the consciousness gets reflected here, then what happens? A third entity is born. They were two different things. But now, what do we say? This one has become sentient. And that sentiency which was first acquired by the intellect or the I thought, then passes on to the rest of the body. So the entire body now appears sentient. How? It was all inert. Yes, but no more. Why? Because now a third entity is born, as it were. There was consciousness, there is this body. But when consciousness gets reflected in the mind, then that consciousness passes on to the rest of the body. And then what do we say? Then an ahankara is born. Now this consciousness thinks, I am only this much. I am of the size of the body. That is why we say, I am 5 feet. I am only 4 feet. I have so much of weight, or I have no weight at all. I am very skinny. Different people have different complexes. If the body has one kind of color, then you feel, I wish God had made me different. I wish God had given me little more height. I would not need to wear high heels. All this who is thinking? Consciousness getting reflected here. And it thinks I am this much. Complexes have begun. Samsara belongs to him, whom neither to consciousness, neither to body. But when it gets reflected in the mind, then consciousness, as it were, becomes of the size of the mind and the body, rest of the body. So, because so union of this truth. So what does the verse say? It says that Chaya ahankara yoho aikyam. The aikyam, the union of consciousness getting reflected in the I thought is of what nature? It is like fire and iron ball coming together. When they come together, what happens? A third entity is born, red hot iron ball. Similarly, when consciousness gets reflected in the mind and when it passes on to the body, sense organs, everyone, then what happens? They also appear conscious, they also appear sentient, and then it thinks I am this much only. So this is where the sense of limitation belongs to. This happens when these two, as it were, come together. So this ahankara has properties of both. It is consciousness belonging to the consciousness. It also exhibits, this ahankara exhibits the some properties of consciousness and also that of the body. See, it appears conscious, it becomes conscious because of the chitchaya, reflection of consciousness. So it appears conscious. So that property is from the consciousness, and it is limited also. It has only certain height, certain weight, certain looks, certain capacities. Why that much? Because body is that much. So you follow, it has properties of both. Ahankara has properties of both. So this ahankara, now if we inquire, then who is this ahankara? It has no basis if we inquire. If consciousness looks at itself, I know who I am, and body is body. Even when consciousness gets reflected in the mind, if it doesn't think I am only this much, I am of the size of the body, if it doesn't think, then no problem even if it gets reflected. So when you inquire in this manner, inquire into the reality of consciousness as well as the reality of matter, then we can separate. Then it doesn't matter how I appear, because I know who I am and what the body is. Body is inert. I am not that. Mano, buddhi, chitta, ahankar, chittani naham. Nacha shrotra jihve, nacha grana netre. I am not any of this. Even though I am getting reflected, even though I am getting reflected in the mirror, which is distorted, my reflection is distorted, and still I know it is because of that that I look like that. In reality, I am not like that. Similarly, this ahankara has no basis, but if we take it to be real, then it has all the capacity to bother us and create thousands and crores of complexes. Grantihi. In reality, it is chit jada granthi, unholy wedlock of what? Otherwise, wedlock is very pure. When the man and woman gets married, good. It is holy wedlock. But when consciousness and matter come together, then this ahankara is born, and it is called unholy wedlock. Why? Because it creates thousands of complexes. Grantihi. So this is where the problem lies, and this is what we have to understand. So this text is beautifully inquiring into and explaining to us why we feel the way we feel. We feel, if the body is of woman, then I think I am only woman. I am bound by everyone. I have no freedom. Everybody rules over me. Different kind of complex for woman. For man, different kind of complex. I have to shoulder all the responsibilities. I am the only earning member. I have so much of stress, this, that, etc. So many things. But who is man? Who is woman? Body is man, body is woman. Consciousness is consciousness. It is neither man nor woman. Then what is this? It is just a reflection getting into the body. And if it thinks I am thus finished, samsara is begun. So this text is separating the two. Viveka, Drg Drashya Vivek. I am Drashta and this is Drashya. Drashta need not judge itself from the Drashya. So this we will look into further. So this is how the text will proceed. We will proceed further next time. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Shankaram Shankaracharyam Keshavam Badarayanam Sutrabhashya Krutau Vande Bhagavantau Punah Punah Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavadvyaptatehaya Dakshinamurtaye Namaha.